Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a stack of source material, research papers, and clinical notes, and we're going deep on a topic that affects, well, far too many families.
Yeah.
Pediatric Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder.
Or OCD, yes.
Specifically, we are dissecting the one intervention that the clinical science consistently calls the gold standard. That's exposure and response prevention, or ERP. And the mission today is pretty simple: to transform this really systematic, highly personalized therapeutic blueprint into a clear understanding of exactly how this process works, how it breaks that relentless cycle of OCD in kids and teens.
And that mission is just vital because while OCD gets portrayed in the media as, a quirky adult thing, the reality for your person is that it's a serious illness.
It's debilitating.
It is. The sources all confirm it affects about 1 to 2% of all children and adolescents. Now, that might sound small, but it translates into just significant functional impairment.
We're not talking about just a small hang-up, are we?
No, not at all. We're talking about real pervasive disruption across social life, school, family. I mean, when a disorder makes a child late for school every single morning because of these long checking rituals, or prevents them from playing sports because of contamination fears, it's stealing their childhood.
And the urgency for a timely, evidence-based intervention it's just paramount. We're talking about the practice parameters from groups like the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the AACAP, and the findings from, multiple large-scale clinical trials.
And they don't mince words.
No, they don't. ERP is the recommended frontline therapy. It's effective, it's measurable, and it's systematic.
And our goal today isn't just to say, hey, this works. It's to give you a clinical level understanding of the rationale behind every single step. We need to explore the engineering of this approach.
Okay, let's unpack this variability then, because OCD isn't one single thing, is it? It's really a cluster of different presentations.
No, absolutely.
The source material hits on this heterogeneity right away. How the disorder just manifests so differently from one child to the next. You might have one kid whose symptoms are all about contamination. Their compulsion is super visible. Maybe they're washing their hands 5-10 times after touching a doorknob.
Right, or wiping down every single object they interact with. And then on the other hand, you have a youth whose symptoms are largely internal or, centered on these abstract concepts.
Like what?
It could be a child experiencing what we call scrupulosity. The obsessions there are about religious or moral perfection, and that leads to these constant repetitive prayer or confession rituals. Or maybe it's the just right phenomenon, which is less about germs and more about, say, precision or symmetry. Think of a child who needs their shoes lined up perfectly. Or they have to enter and exit a doorway, 5 times until it clicks, until it feels right.
So the underlying distress, that spike of anxiety or discomfort, that's the common thread.
That's universal, yes.
Yeah.
But the behavioral output is, like you said, a tapestry of different rituals.
And this personalization, this idea of recognizing different subtypes, it seems critical. Because while the framework is always ERP, the execution has to be tailored exactly to that child's unique pattern of fear and ritual.
Exactly. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach.
It's clear this treatment is systematic. Before we get to the how of the exposures, we have to talk about the why. What is the engine driving this cycle that ERP is designed to disrupt? ERP is a specialized form of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, but it focuses really aggressively on behavior, right?
It does. And what's fascinating here is that the OCD is not maintained by the initial intrusive thought. If it were, everyone who has an odd intrusive thought would develop OCD.
Right. We all have those.
We all have them. The disorder is maintained by this highly effective but ultimately catastrophic learning mechanism. It's known as the negative reinforcement cycle. And this is the absolute key to understanding why OCD persists and why those compulsions feel so necessary.
Okay. When I was reading about negative reinforcement, it seemed a little counterintuitive. Can you explain how something that gives immediate relief is actually the thing keeping the problem going?
Absolutely. Let's just walk through the loop step by step. So the cycle begins with the obsession. That's a persistent, unwanted, often really distressing thought, image, or impulse.
Okay.
For a child with contamination fears, it's that sudden, intrusive thought. That doorknob is covered in deadly germs. If I touch it, I'm going to get sick and die.
And that thought is immediately followed by a huge spike in anxiety.
A massive, debilitating spike. It could be anxiety, fear, disgust. That feeling is what we call the aversive stimulus.
That's the bad feeling the brain wants to get rid of.
Exactly. The brain is programmed to eliminate aversive stimuli. So the child immediately engages in the compulsion, the ritual. Whether it's mental or physical, they wash their hands 5 times or they recite a protective phrase.
And it works.
And it works. Critically, this ritual successfully removes that immediate spike of anxiety. And that removal of the bad feeling, that relief, that is the negative reinforcer.
Ah, okay, I see the paradox now. So the behavior, the washing, gets rewarded because it makes the bad feeling go away.
Precisely. The child's brain learns this deep, powerful, instantaneous lesson. It says, I was highly distressed, I did the ritual, and the distress went down. Therefore, the ritual is what I must do next time to survive.
So that short-term relief is the immediate reward, but the long-term cost is huge.
It's huge because it strengthens the link between the obsession and the compulsion. The child never learns that the anxiety would have eventually gone down on its own. They never learn that the feared outcome is actually unlikely. They only learn to ritualize.
Okay, so if the compulsion is the brain's sort of maladaptive escape route,
Yeah,
ERP is designed to block that escape route.
that's the perfect analogy.
And this brings us to the 2 fundamental parts, exposure and response prevention.
Right. So when we talk about exposure, we mean encouraging the youth to systematically and gradually face the uncomfortable thoughts, images, or real-life situations that trigger the anxiety. This is active confrontation.
So if the fear is germs, you touch the doorknob.
You touch the doorknob. If the obsession is about symmetry, the exposure is purposely placing your socks on unevenly.
But the sources are really insistent on this. Exposure by itself is not enough. The response prevention part is the non-negotiable anchor of the whole thing.
Response prevention, or RP, is where the therapeutic magic happens. The youth must refrain, absolutely refrain, from doing the compulsion after the exposure. If they touch the doorknob, they cannot wash their hands for a predetermined challenging amount of time.
So they're blocking that negative reinforcement loop on purpose.
They're deliberately blocking it. If they write a sentence, they cannot erase it and rewrite it until it feels right. They have to just leave it imperfect.
So what's the ultimate learning goal here? What does the child actually get from this confrontation?
They get 2 primary interlocking forms of learning. First, they engage in what we call violating expectancy.
Violating expectancies.
They predict the feared outcome. If I don't wash my hands, I'll get a deadly disease. And then they complete the exposure and they see that the feared outcome does not happen. The old fear-based association, doorknob equals illness, gets undermined.
And the second thing.
The second thing is they learn distress tolerance. They stay in the situation long enough for the anxiety, which naturally peaks and then subsides, to come down on its own without the ritual. This is the core of what we call inhibitory learning. They're creating a new, safer memory. Touching the doorknob is fine, that competes with and eventually overrides the old scary memory.
That idea of inhibitory learning is so powerful. It's not about erasing the old fear.
You can't erase it.
It's about building a stronger, safer alternative pathway next to it.
Precisely. It's about building evidence against the OCD. And because that original fear memory is still in there, this new learning requires repetition, it requires consistency, and honestly, a lot of perseverance. We have to stress that ERP is not a one-time thing. It is a marathon of small acts of bravery.
Okay, so before any of this really difficult exposure work happens, the sources spend a lot of time on the foundational work. Psychoeducation. You can't just tell a child to start touching things they're afraid of.
No, you'd have zero buy-in.
You have to set a solid rationale for the pain they're about to endure. It's all about motivation and making sure the entire family is on the same page.
This stage really does set the trajectory for treatment success. We start by defining OCD in a way that's accessible but still respectful of the child's intelligence. We might describe obsessions as uninvited guests. Thoughts, pictures, or urges that bother you over and over, just knocking at the door of your mind when you don't want them there.
And compulsions are what you do to try and get them to leave.
Exactly. They are the behaviors you feel you have to do until the distress goes down, whether that's checking something physically or, reviewing something in your mind. And you have to tailor the examples.
Right, to their specific experience.
And their specific experience. For a child with somatic obsessions, fears about bodily symptoms or illness, we might use an analogy of someone who checks their pulse every 5 minutes. For a kid with those just right needs, we define it as needing to repeat an action until you get this subjective feeling of completeness or balance.
And a key part of this, as you mentioned earlier, is normalization, making them feel less alone in this.
It is absolutely essential. Sharing the prevalence rate, that 1 to 2%, It immediately fights that feeling of isolation. It can be incredibly helpful to ask the child to, say, visualize their school, maybe there are 500 kids there, and then you calculate how many of their peers might also be struggling with this.
That takes it from I'm the only weird one who does this
To this is a common, manageable, brain-based condition.
but I'm sure the question every family has is about etiology. Why my child? What caused this?
It's the first question, always. And caregivers, they rightly want a definitive answer, but we have to explain that OCD is multifactorial. There's no single cause.
So you talk about genetics.
We address the genetic component, yes. The risk is certainly higher for children whose parents or close relatives have OCD, which points to a genetic vulnerability. But it's not a direct, one-to-one inheritance. We also touch on biological factors. There's documented abnormalities in specific brain circuits, sometimes called the corticostriatal thalamocortical loops, and also issues with neurotransmitters like serotonin and glutamate.
So that combination of a genetic blueprint and maybe some kind of environmental trigger that can give enough context for the family without placing blame.
Absolutely. And the expert perspective here is crucial. You validate their curiosity about the causes, but you immediately recenter the focus. While genetics and brain chemistry are interesting, the cause has very little bearing on the treatment plan. Our energy has to be on the action, on the present reality. We know what works, and that's what we're going to commit to.
And that commitment is a family affair. The sources make it so clear that ERP is largely a family-based approach. This isn't just a therapist and a child in a room.
This cannot be overstated. Caregivers transition from being often accidental accomplices to the OCD to being co-therapists.
Wow, co-therapists.
They are. They're needed for supportive coaching, for modeling bravery, and for making sure the homework gets done, which is always assigned. Exposure homework is where the bulk of this new learning happens. And without consistent caregiver support, compliance rates just plummet.
And their most critical role is stopping something called family accommodation.
Which we will get into much more deeply.
I can just imagine, though, when you introduce the concept of exposure, of asking them to help push their child toward their fear, that family hesitation must just spike. I mean, it goes against every parental instinct to protect their child from pain.
It does, and we have to acknowledge that. It's often the #1 source of resistance. To address this, we use a values-based approach.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means we don't argue with the fear. We don't say, your fear of germs is silly. Instead, we link the short-term, intense discomfort of the exposure to the long-term, life-enhancing gains. We ask the child and the family, what has OCD taken from you?
So if OCD prevents the child from doing their homework because of obsessive rereading, the goal isn't just stop rereading. The goal is get your free time back so you can go to the skate park.
Precisely. We focus on the life the child values that OCD has taken away. We use the pain of the exposure as the price of admission to get that freedom back.
And what about that parent fear that this is all going to make things worse?
We have to address that directly with data. Research has consistently shown no significant differences in dropout rates or satisfaction between kids who get exposure therapy and those who get non-exposure therapy. It confirms that while it's difficult, the systematic approach makes it manageable and effective, not damaging.
Okay, so with that foundation set, the next very detailed step is building this personalized treatment blueprint. The fear hierarchy.
Yes, the fear hierarchy. This is a list that's completely unique to the child, and it systematically orders all their OCD-related triggers and behaviors from the easiest thing to confront to the most terrifying.
It sounds like taking this big, amorphous, overwhelming cloud of OCD symptoms and making them concrete, measurable.
Yeah.
How do you quantify anxiety in a systematic way?
We quantify it using the subjective units of distress scale, or SUDS. It's a simple 0 to 10 numerical rating system. 0 is absolutely no distress at all, like the feeling of reading a recipe. 10 is the highest possible distress, maybe the feeling of being trapped in a burning house.
And the child, parent, and therapist all work together to assign a SEDS rating to every single obsession or compulsion.
Yes, it's collaborative. And ranking these items is crucial because it facilitates that psychological buy-in. It removes the guesswork and it lets the child build momentum.
Because you start at the bottom.
You have to. It's fundamental for building mastery. We typically start exposures at the lower end of the hierarchy, a SUDS 2 or a 3. This lets the youth build confidence, practice their distress tolerance skills, and get those first few small wins. If you try to jump to a SUDS 9 on day 1, you are guaranteeing failure, probably trauma, and the family is not coming back.
You leverage success to build motivation for the harder stuff.
That's the idea.
What's fascinating is the flexibility of this hierarchy. It's not like a rigid, finished list, is it? How do you manage that?
We tell families that symptoms are living things. They change, they mutate, sometimes new ones pop up as old ones fade. So we have to continually update the hierarchy. And beyond that, we teach the concept of titrating difficulty.
Breaking it down.
Breaking an item down into smaller, manageable chunks. For example, if a child's contamination fear is at a SUDS 7 for touching a public doorknob, we don't start there. We start lower. Maybe touching the bottom of the doorknob with just a pinky finger for 5 seconds. Once that gets easy, maybe the SUDS drops to a 1, then we iterate, touching the whole doorknob for 10 seconds.
Breaking the difficulty down like that turns this overwhelming task into a series of achievable micro-goals.
Exactly. Let's look at some of the source examples to really get the depth of this. Consider a child with checking compulsions related to fire safety. The starting point at SUDS 2 is almost abstract. Write words like burn, flame, or ash.
Oh, very low stakes.
Very low stakes. An easy confrontation, a step up. A SUDS 5 might be saying, I am a bad person for not checking the stove, out loud 10 times.
And the top of the mountain, the SUDS 10, is asking the child to cook a meal that requires a continual simmer and then leave the house for 2 hours without adjusting or checking the burners.
The commitment required for that final step is profound. It requires the child to completely surrender control and accept the possibility of catastrophe. They have to know intellectually the risk is minimal, but feel emotionally that it is high. The therapeutic goal isn't just tolerating anxiety, it's accepting the inherent uncertainty of life.
That depth of confrontation is astounding. The sources also provided a deeply intense example for scrupulosity or sexual obsessions.
Yes. For a child struggling with sexual obsessions focused on a parent, the SUDS 2 might be simply writing the taboo words, sex, penis, vagina. But as we scale that hierarchy, we get into massive expectancy violations. The SUDS 10 in this example is to read a detailed sexual script involving mother allowed to mother with eye contact.
Okay, reading that, I have to challenge the therapeutic intensity there. How do you manage the ethical and psychological fallout for both the child and the parent who has to participate in something like that?
That is an excellent and a necessary challenge. The therapist has to ensure these exposures are only done when necessary. They're fully consensual, and they're approached with the absolute utmost sensitivity and clinical grounding. The goal is never to traumatize. The goal is to utterly neutralize the fear.
Okay.
In cases like that, the fear isn't the sexual content itself. The fear is the disgust, the shame, the perceived danger of the thought, or the fear of God retribution. By exposing the child to the thought in the safest possible environment, right there next to the source of their love and security, their parent, it strips the thought of its power. We prioritize emotional safety through the whole process. The parent has to understand they're helping the child dismantle the fear's weapon.
That clarifies the rationale.
Yes.
Now let's talk preparation. Before this hard work begins, coping skills are introduced. But you stress that they have a supportive, not a central role. Why is that?
They're introduced before exposures to help with general anxiety and motivation, maybe practicing mindfulness to understand their physical response to stress. However, during the exposure itself, the primary mandate is to feel the distress. If a child uses a deep breathing exercise or thought suppression during the exposure, they are actively preventing that inhibitory learning from happening. They learn, I survived because I used my skill, not I survived because the anxiety went away on its own.
So a motivational skill, like reviewing their list of things OCD has blocked them from doing, that's okay because it's goal-oriented.
Yeah.
But actively trying to dampen the fear in the moment is a form of response prevention failure.
Precisely. And this leads us to why we generally stay away from techniques that are central to other CBT approaches like cognitive restructuring.
Right. Analyzing the likelihood of the feared outcome. Why would you avoid calculating the probability of the house burning down? That seems logical.
Because it runs a huge risk of becoming a compulsion itself.
Of course.
A child with OCD is already highly intelligent and analytical. If we focus on probability, they might compulsively calculate risk percentages, constantly seeking that 100% certainty that the risk is 0. This obsessive intellectual exercise is just another way to escape the core problem, which is uncertainty. In ERP, the answer to the risk calculation is simply, I don't know, and I have to tolerate not knowing. The behavioral work provides the evidence better than any mental debate ever could.
Okay, so we have the blueprint, the motivation, the rationale. Now we're into the actual execution of the exposures, which is the bulk of the treatment. What's the typical protocol for an in-session exposure?
The protocol is structured to empower both the child and the parent. The therapist first describes the exposure, let's say it's touching the bottom of a trash can. Then the therapist models it, demonstrating calmness, showing there's no negative consequence.
They do it first.
They do it first, then the child tries it, and the caregiver shatters the whole process, learning the precise language and coaching skills they'll need. This sets the stage for home practice, which is where most of the critical learning happens.
And we have to reiterate the importance of that gradual titration. How do you approach those really elaborate, time-consuming rituals?
So if a child has a complex motor ritual, say, needing to touch certain objects in a sequence 3 times, we use a decremental approach. We start by breaking the ritual down. The first exposure might be performing the sequence only once, then maybe only twice. We interrupt the chain of behavior at the easiest point.
And for compulsions that take a lot of time, like a 2-hour shower.
We chip away at the duration. We might set a rule that they can only shower for 90 minutes. Once they master that, we drop it to 75 and so on.
So you're gradually decreasing the supports, making sure the ultimate goal codal ritual eradication is achieved, but without overwhelming the child.
Exactly. It's about engineering success. We also use 2 main types of exposure. The primary preferred method is in vivo exposure. That's the hands-on real-life experience, physically touching a dirty surface or intentionally blurring a sentence while you're writing.
But the sources also make a strong case for imaginal exposures. When is it necessary to just have the child describe a feared situation in vivid detail?
Imaginal exposures are critical when the feared outcome is abstract or impossible to replicate in the clinic. For example, if a child fears getting HIV, we can't expose them to HIV. So we have them write or narrate a detailed script about contracting the virus, feeling sick, dealing with the consequences, sights, sounds, emotions.
Or the house burning down.
Or the house burning down. The exposure is sitting for 20 minutes and vividly picturing the smell of smoke and the sound of sirens. This often serves as a great stepping stone toward in vivo exposures, or when the feared consequence has a really long delay, like getting sick a week later.
Okay, let's get into the golden rules, the absolute non-negotiables for successful exposures, because this is where families can slip up. The first rule is about repetition and generalization.
Learning is repetition. That inhibitory learning requires challenging the old memory again and again and again. If the child only touches the doorknob in the safety of the therapist's office, their brain learns it's safe in that room. They have to practice touching the doorknob at the library, the gas station, the school cafeteria in multiple contexts. This forces the brain to generalize the new, safer memory across all environments.
And this repetition directly reinforces the second critical rule, tolerating uncertainty. The core function of every single compulsion is this delusion of control. ERP dismantles this. We teach the youth that life is inherently uncertain. We can't know with 100% assurance that the stove is off or that we won't get a germ. The exposure forces them to tolerate that existential reality. It shows them that the anxiety produced by uncertainty is manageable, even without the ritual. Okay, now for the rule that seems to fly in the face of every natural parenting instinct. No reassurance.
This is paramount. Reassurance saying things like, it's okay, I checked the stove earlier, or don't worry, nothing bad is going to happen. It immediately undermines the treatment.
But isn't that what parents are supposed to do? Comfort their child?
It is, and that's why it's so hard. But reassurance is, functionally, a short-term compulsion provided by the parent. It removes the immediate anxiety, which negatively reinforces the need for external confirmation, and it prevents the child from violating the expectancy themselves.
So instead of being a comforting presence, the parent has to act like a behavioral scientist.
Precisely. We frame the exposure as a scientific experiment. Step 1. Ask the child to state their fear hypothesis. For example, if I don't check the light switch 5 times, we'll lose power and Dad'll get mad.
Okay.
Step 2. Complete the exposure. Leave the house after 1 switch flip. Step 3. Process the data. What actually happened? Did the house lose power? No. This experiential evidence is far more powerful than any verbal reassurance could ever be.
But there's a fine line here between refusing reassurance and refusing support. How should caregivers shift their dialogue?
The focus has to shift from the fear to the effort. A caregiver should never say, you won't get sick. They should say, wow, you are so brave for facing the germs, or that was a high SUDS task and you pushed through it. I have so much confidence in your ability to beat this.
So you're commending the child's courage and their self-efficacy.
Yes, without providing the OCD-specific reassurance that just feeds the loop.
Okay, the final golden rule. No distraction or experiential avoidance.
When a child is facing a trigger, they must be fully present in the discomfort. If they try to distract themselves by listening to loud music, watching a YouTube video, forcing themselves to think about a vacation, they're engaging in mental response prevention. They're avoiding the feared internal state.
So they're learning how to successfully distract, not how to successfully tolerate the distress.
Exactly. They're not learning the right lesson.
So if a parent or therapist sees a child visibly checking out, looking away or humming, how do they gently but firmly redirect them back to the fear?
We need concrete redirection dialogue. Let's use an example. A child is doing an exposure by leaving a public restroom without washing their hands, but they immediately pull out their phone. The caregiver would say, "I notice you're on your phone right now. What are you thinking about?" The child says, "Oh, I'm just watching a TikTok."
Right.
The therapist then intervenes. "I know that your anxiety is high right now, and watching TikTok helps you feel better. But our mission today is to learn that you can feel this high anxiety and survive it without needing to escape. Let's put the phone away and focus on the feeling in your hands and what your brain is telling you." You gently but firmly hold that boundary until the child is fully present and the anxiety naturally crests and falls.
Okay, so ERP is this powerful system, but in the real world, I'm sure it's often complicated by other factors. We have to anticipate those barriers.
Absolutely.
Let's start with a major one, insight and motivation. Especially with younger kids, they often lack the developmental capacity to understand why they're doing this painful work. How do you incentivize them?
Lack of insight is extremely common. Solution one is a highly structured, age-appropriate reward system. For younger kids, the rewards have to be immediate, frequent, and tangible. A small toy, extra time on a favorite game, a specific treat.
And for teenagers?
For adolescents, we move to a token economy or a point system that's tied to a larger, more meaningful reward. Tickets to a concert, a coveted new piece of equipment. The incentive has to be powerful enough to overcome the psychological friction of facing their fear.
And if it's just pure resistance to the painful work, you can turn the exposure into something that feels less like therapy.
Exactly, you shift the frame. Contamination fears can become a scavenger hunt where the child has to touch various dirty checkpoints to find a hidden prize.
Or a science experiment.
The scientific experiment is the most powerful technique. We stop saying, "You must do this," and we start asking, "What happens if we only touch the switch once? Let's collect data and see if your hypothesis is correct." This engages their curiosity and moves them into a less defensive stance. We also use motivational interviewing, asking the child to articulate how ERP will benefit them, not their parents, but their own personal goals.
Now let's spend some time on that major barrier we promised to revisit, family accommodation.
Family accommodation is the silent saboteur of ERP. It's pervasive. It happens daily in the majority of families that come for treatment, and it's defined by any action the family takes to reduce or avoid the child's distress related to their OCD.
Can you give us a few concrete examples of what that looks like?
Common examples are things like facilitating avoidance, so driving a longer route to avoid a bridge the child fears, modifying family routines, like allowing the child extra time in the morning for their compulsions, which makes everyone late,
And reassurance?
excessive and repetitive reassurance, or actively participating in the compulsion, like a parent rechecking the locks because their child demands it.
And that parental instinct is to relieve the child's pain? So they often don't see this as a bad thing. They see it as being supported.
And that's the conflict. It is done with positive intent, but it is contrary to ERP because it directly feeds the negative reinforcement cycle. Every time the parent accommodates, the child learns, "I am too fragile to handle this, and I need help to manage my anxiety."
The child stays reliant on the ritual or the parent to feel safe.
Exactly.
So how do you address this with parents who are highly anxious and used to accommodating?
First, we normalize and validate their effort. We acknowledge they've been doing what they thought was best. Then we transition to systematically dismantling the accommodation behaviors. We often add the accommodation itself to the child's fear hierarchy. Yeah. For instance, if the parent has been giving 10 minutes of reassurance about germs every day, that's a SUDS-5, the exposure is reducing that reassurance time to 8 minutes. The ultimate goal is to eliminate all accommodation. It has to be done systematically, collaboratively, and with the clear expectation that anxiety will spike initially, but that's the necessary signal that learning is happening.
We also need to consider comorbid psychopathology. If a child is dealing with ADHD or depression alongside their OCD, how does that change the plan?
Comorbidity definitely attenuates the response to treatment. If a youth has externalizing symptoms like ADHD or disruptive behavior disorder, they often struggle with the focus and sustained effort that exposures require.
Right.
For these cases, we have to integrate behavioral parent training principles. That means consistent use of labeled praise, robust reward systems, and planned ignoring of the ritualistic behavior. And if the ADHD symptoms are so severe that the child just cannot stay present for the task, concurrent medication for ADHD might be necessary to allow the ERP work to even happen.
What about internalizing symptoms, like major depressive disorder?
The relationship there is nuanced. If the depression is primary and severe, the child can't function, is experiencing anhedonia, struggles with basic daily tasks, then depression-focused treatment, like behavioral activation, might need to stabilize the child first.
But if it's the other way around?
If, however, the depression is clearly secondary, the child is depressed because OCD has stolen their life, then we proceed with ERP. And as the child starts reclaiming their life through ERP success, the depressive symptoms often just attenuate naturally.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the insidious challenges that undermine RP: subtle compulsions and white knuckling.
These are the hardest to catch. Subtle compulsions are those surreptitious rituals, mental or quick physical actions that the child performs to secretly undermine the response prevention.
Give me an example.
A child with checking fears might, as they walk away from the door, quickly touch their pants in a specific way as a kind of good luck ritual. Or a child with harm obsessions might mentally recite a protective phrase like, "I would never do that," every time they hold a sharp object. If those are missed, response prevention has failed.
How does a therapist or parent even identify something so fast or so internal?
It requires a really thorough, upfront assessment and using awareness-building exercises. We have the child keep purposeful logs, not just of the rituals, but of the thoughts they have right after a trigger, trying to capture those mental rituals. We also set up a communication system, a quick hand signal from the therapist that means, "I see you doing a covert ritual, stop immediately." This helps the child gain awareness of how automatic their compulsions are.
And what about the problem of white knuckling? This is the child who is physically present but mentally just rushing through it.
White knuckling is highly problematic because even though they complete the task, they reinforce the belief that escape is the goal. They are surviving the exposure by gritting their teeth, clenching their fists, and counting down the seconds until freedom. They learn to escape, not to tolerate.
So if you see the visible signs, body tension, shallow breathing, the child saying they're fine despite clearly being in high distress, how do you intervene?
You slow down the process immediately. You introduce varying and unexpected time limits. Instead of saying 10 minutes, you say, "We'll stop when your SUDS drops by 3 points." Or you use a completely random timer. This prevents the countdown. And most importantly, you redirect their focus to their somatic sensations. "I notice your jaw's clenched. Focus on that. What does the anxiety feel like in your chest? Stay with that feeling." This forces them to be fully present with the discomfort, which is where the crucial learning happens.
Okay, finally we turn to relapse prevention. After all this difficult, successful work, how do we manage the transition out of therapy and prevent the symptoms from coming back?
The transition has to be gradual. As the child achieves substantial symptom reduction and resumes developmentally appropriate functioning, getting back to school, having friends over, we start down titrating the sessions, from weekly to biweekly, then to monthly.
And you're teaching the family what to look for.
The core of relapse prevention is instructing families on the warning signs. An increase in the frequency, intensity, or distress related to old or even new OCD symptoms.
And instead of panicking, the family is encouraged to treat any symptom resurgence as a challenge to be conquered with the skills they've learned.
Exactly. We teach them that symptoms often wax and wane, but the skills are lifelong. They are equipped to systematically confront a symptom resurgence using ERP principles without needing to immediately come back to intense therapy. We often encourage booster sessions, maybe once a month for a few months, especially if a child remains partially symptomatic or needs a refresher during a stressful time, like starting a new school year.
And you can review the original hierarchy.
We often review the original completed fear hierarchy to reinforce, objectively, just how far they've come.
This has been a remarkably thorough deep dive into exposure and response prevention. It's systematic, it's time-limited, it's goal-oriented, and collaboratively fostered. The ultimate lesson seems to be that OCD hinges on this maladaptive pursuit of certainty and control, and ERP teaches the powerful lesson of living bravely in the face of uncertainty.
The clinical takeaway is that we are decreasing the child's dependence on those rituals and fostering new, adaptive, realistic appraisals of their feared situations. It is fundamentally about building courage.
And if the core mechanism of ERP is the violation of expectancies and the tolerance of uncertainty, here's a final thought for you to mull on. What everyday non-OCD scenarios might we encounter where we are negatively reinforcing fear without even realizing it? Think about that moment of anxiety before sending a difficult email, which we then avoid by compulsively checking our social media. Is that a form of response prevention failure? Are we teaching our brains that avoidance is the only way to alleviate discomfort in that situation? Something to consider as you continue learning about the patterns of the human brain.
An excellent application of the principles. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.